great to see you. So I think we're really keen to understand a number of things on this chat. There's obviously the theme around leadership and what it's like to be a founder and what it's like to work in a scaling tech business. But I think the starting point has to be for you guys, what people are going to be really interested to understand is this world, maybe that's not the right word, galaxy maybe, of space tech and what that technology can actually do for us, where it's headed. And one of the things that's really interesting about you guys, you talk a lot about non-Earth imagery, which is taking us into a really, really niche world. So can you explain to us where you guys have started, so where you're headed? Just tell us all about HEO.
Holy shit, James. Well, I hope I can say the drop an S-bomb here and there. But,
we're British. Yeah. We like swearing. Swearing's fine.
Oh, good. Yeah, good. So yeah, definitely keen to talk about what non-Earth imaging is. So it's an interesting word because it describes what it isn't. And weirdly, oftentimes Earth is in the background of these images that are taken. But really what non-Earth imaging attempts to describe is the imaging of satellites from other satellites. So instead of Earth observation, looking at the ground, you're trying to look at other satellites specifically. Really, I think there's other areas that kind of jump off of this. So looking at celestial bodies like the moon or asteroids might be involved as well. But yeah, mainly specifically talking about other satellites is really where non-Earth imaging is. So what's interesting about this industry is that it actually has been around for a while, primarily done by governments and primarily behind closed doors. We didn't even know that we were accidentally doing something that governments had done until about 2 years in. We had someone come to us and they'd seen some of the images we'd taken, and they were a retired general, and they said, oh, this is called sat squared, and we've only just declassified the word. So they used to call it sat squared behind closed doors, and then commercially they started to call it non-Earth imagery, mainly to make people in the intelligence realm more comfortable, I think. But yeah, it's been done for a long time. It's very effective as an intelligence tool, but we think it has further application, and our customers think so as well. So beyond intelligence, there's also repair and maintenance of satellites. There's the understanding of other bodies such as debris or celestial objects as well. And really, I think there's huge applications and huge kind of understanding about the future of humanity and about where we might go whenever that involves the space realm. So it's an interesting application area, and I think it's a lot bigger than everyone realizes, and would love to talk about why that seems to be as well.
Well, one of the things I was chatting to a contact in my network recently. He works in probably more geospatial Earth observation stuff, but is overlapping into perhaps some of the areas that you do. And one of the things he was saying that's where people are really interested is actually understanding what does it mean for them. How do I apply this to my business? How do I apply this to my customers? How does it all work? So I guess that this probably goes into a bit of a broader question, which is like going back 8-9 years when you founded the business. How did you even have the foresight of what this thing, how's that come about? I suppose part one is the questions, how's that come about? And part two is like, how do you actually educate people to, hey, this is something you might want to buy?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And when you said geospatial just now, I was like, well, what are we? I guess just plain spatial.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so when we actually started, we started as an asteroid mining company. Okay. So we were, I did my PhD research on asteroid mining and specifically the astrodynamics, so how do objects move around asteroids. And what's interesting is that in asteroid, I guess, research and missions, the big part of how that's done is having a satellite fly past an asteroid and take photos as it goes past. And then from those images, you're able to infer a lot about asteroids. So that was really the initial case. And I personally think that asteroids will be a big part of the future of humanity. So I thought that was really important. And then we had a problem, or I had a problem, and then my co-founders started sharing the same problem, which is that it's really hard to get images of asteroids because they're really far away,
Right.
they're really small. When they do come close, it's quite transient. And so part of my PhD research was about, okay, how do we better look at these asteroids? It turns out a lot of them come really close to Earth. So we've got a whole bunch coming closer than the moon every year. I think the ones that we know about is somewhere between 1 and 200 every year. There's probably a whole bunch more that we don't know about coming within that distance. But once it comes that close, you've actually got the ability potentially to have a spacecraft orbiting around the Earth still, so not departing Earth and going on a specific asteroid mission, but you just wait in Earth orbit for the asteroids to come kind of close to you, and then you can zip out and have a look at those. So long story short, we thought there was a business there when we started the company. For a few reasons, there is not yet. We think it will be in the future. But it turns out that there is a business about looking at other satellites. And we were really fortunate that we had a kind of a breadcrumb trail of people saying, yeah, this would be interesting if you started to look at other satellites and so on. So I think we were already out there. We're already going to do it. We're very confident about that. And then fortunately, we had some early, I guess, supporters who were saying, maybe you want to start looking at other satellites. Maybe that would be interesting. So we fell into it that way. And next thing you know, it turns out there's this whole ecosystem of doing it already, but behind, I guess, the black curtain. So emerging from behind that was really interesting.
So a couple of questions from that. You said something really interesting, which was around asteroids and that they're going to be, really significant in the future. So there's a sub question to that, which is just a bit of a dumb question, but I think I understand. But what exactly is an asteroid, and why is that going to be so prominent in the future?
No, yeah, good question. So an asteroid is a coherent rock that typically, or the ones that we know about, orbit around the sun. It's possible to have asteroids beyond the sun's orbit as well, though. But they're just, I guess, a good way to think about it. They're left behind pieces of planetoids. So planets that never formed became asteroids, and there's a variety of reasons for why that might be. But the good news is that there are a whole bunch of different types of asteroids with different types of mineralogies.
Okay.
We know this because a lot of them have fallen to Earth as meteorites, and then we can have a look inside. I guess what's interesting to me is that we don't necessarily know what meteorite type maps to what asteroid type. So we know that each has spectral types. We don't necessarily know which spectral type of meteorite belongs to which spectral type of asteroid, primarily because there's weathering of asteroids. So they actually change color.
Right.
So the outside of an asteroid is different from an inside of an asteroid. So when it falls to the ground, we see the inside only, but when it's in space, it's the outside, and it's weathered in a weird way. But yeah, that's what an asteroid is, just a bit of rock that's kind of circling around the sun, and it never formed a true planet.
Right, I see. Okay, and why is it going to be so significant moving forward?
Well, I think the primary thing for me is that they're all in a variety of orbits. So there's 8 or 9 planets, depending on how you count, around the sun, and a bunch of moons as well, but they're all in very set orbits. And asteroids are just by sheer volume of how many there are, there's over 1 million that are known to humanity today. They're in such a variety of different orbits, and they have a variety of different mineralogies. So they're almost like these oases of minerals that are floating in very specific areas. And one really good way to get around the solar system is, instead of carrying everything with you, which is what most missions do today, is kind of jump to different areas and then use resources there. So asteroids provide these oases of resources that you can jump to and use and kind of live off the land, if you will.
Okay, that makes sense. It's almost like a stepping stone into, not living in space, but I get what you mean. Yeah, actually surviving and being able to move around, I suppose.
So yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's not even just human exploration. Like even a robot, it's better for the robot to use minerals as it gets to different spots rather than kind of take everything with it, because it's a little bit ridiculous if you do things that way.
Right. Okay. So take us back in time a little bit. So you've done this PhD and it's asteroids, and you're clearly dead excited and passionate about it, and very knowledgeable. How does that spin into business. You wake up one day, and the other bit, I suppose, is like you want to go do all this observation in space. You're just one guy with some co-founders maybe sat at home. How do you where's the process there? What happened?
Oh, totally. Well, we have immense confidence, as you might have noticed. So I think that's helpful. You can argue whether it's sensible confidence or not, but I think yeah, just by sheer kind of going through these education programs, but also seeing, I guess, what lengths people have to go through to get things done. I think that was really helpful, and I think there's been a few journeys of a few interesting entrepreneurs and also scientists that have really helped there. So I think that really helped. But originally, I actually won a prize to go to a conference with the idea that I described, the specific kind of waiting in Earth orbit for asteroids to come to us. And then won some great acclaim there, got sent kind of halfway around the world to present on this. And everyone at this conference is called the International Astronautical Congress. And everyone at this Congress thought it was an awesome idea. So I was like, oh my God, everyone in the world loves asteroid mining. It's the next thing. Of course, what I didn't realize was that everyone at that, or probably everyone in the world that cared, was at the conference.
Right.
So sadly, it took us 2 years to kind of figure that out, and we went through an accelerator program that was attached to the university where we were studying at. And we actually went out to Silicon Valley and met there were two asteroid mining companies at the time. And what we found was that these companies, I think they legitimately wanted to mine asteroids, but they didn't really have a business plan of how to be sustainable and how to achieve that. So I think that was a huge shock to us, and we were just thinking, oh my gosh, like how are we gonna survive as a company? Like our potential customers, they don't have real businesses. So we're really fortunate to, I guess, have a breadcrumb trail led by some of our current customers about what might actually be valuable. So then looking at other satellites, that became a different application with exactly the same technology, and we started moving towards that. What I will say is that we started out kind of thinking like most space companies think they need to build their own spacecraft. So originally we were building along those lines. And fortunately, one of our early customers was the Australian government. And they said, yep, we really like what you're doing, but this is kind of the pot of cash that we have available. And we thought, you know what, maybe we'll just put our software on an existing satellite and we'll point it at another satellite, and we'll see if that gets an image of a spacecraft. And it was really hard, and it took a really long time to get that done, but it turns out it was quite possible. And then we found out that, in fact, most Earth observation satellites, or satellites that look at the ground, the optical ones at least, they typically are only used 5% of the time, because they're either over the dark side of the Earth or over ocean or over clouds. So we were able to use them during some of those downtimes to have a look at other satellites. So we found that there was this huge potential supply. We found out that there was a way to do this incrementally and quite cost effectively. And we also found out you actually needed a huge volume of satellites to get enough opportunities to look at other spacecraft, because typically they're just so far away. So you need a lot of sensors to be able to get close. So all those things came together, and that's what helped us get started on that road.
So how are you sort of feeling along this journey? Because that feels to me like brilliant idea, not quite going to work. We need to do this. There's loads of changes, there's loads of bumps. So what sort of keeps you on an even keel? What stops you from going, oh, you know what, I'm just going to jack this all in and get a job down at the local
simple
store?
Answer to the question, how do you feel, was, yeah, we felt shit.
Right.
No, I think the more nuanced answer is we were used to getting beaten down. So we'd gone through the PhD process, which is not always, but for us, it was quite brutal. A lot of people drop out of PhD programs in Britain and Australia and the US for that reason. So I think more than half of PhD candidates never finish. And yeah, we just come from really tough kind of upbringing. So I think that really helped as well. So we're able to kind of, get beat down, but it didn't matter. And we're used to not getting paid much as well, so that was helpful too.
Okay, okay, that helps make sense. So then you've gone through this, really interesting learning journey. It feels like the business is, established now. You've got a really clear understanding as to what you're doing. So where's the sort of future for not just, I suppose, humanity, but where's this technology going to take us? What are the actual opportunities? You talked about the asteroids and things. So there's obviously a call to action around the survival of the planet, of Earth, of the planet, of the changing climate, of, are we able to go and live elsewhere? The race to get into space, all this stuff. Where do you see it? Where's the value going to be? What's actually going to happen?
Well, yeah, I think all that's really interesting. I think though there's probably intermediate step as well. So looking at other satellites, I think that's it for us. It started as an intermediate step, but now we're like, wow, this is actually a huge mission in and of itself. So we have an overarching mission to image anything in the solar system on demand. We thought beyond the solar system was a bit ambitious, just due to what we know about interstellar travel. But yeah, looking at everything in Earth orbit to begin with is kind of that intermediate zone. So what that means is primarily looking at other satellites and understanding their current state, understanding what they might be capable of, understanding if a satellite operator is maybe not telling the whole truth to their regulator, and so on. So we're finding a bunch of these use cases. So I think what's been interesting to me is how many applications there are for imaging other satellites. But I think probably the key things here are, one, transparency, so we can try and avoid getting into conflicts. It's kind of a conflicted world at the moment, so let's avoid that. And space is so far away, and I think there's been a lot of kind of scares recently in the international community. So reducing that just by sheer addition of information, I think that's really important, so people don't do silly things. I think looking after satellites so they don't, and trying to analyze issues before they break, or they break completely, I think that's really, really important, and that's something that a lot of customers are trying to do. And then ensuring that there aren't any, I guess, cowboys in space. That's something that's really important too. So what we found is that in space, a lot of people like to sweep things under the carpet, and there's a few reasons for that. And I think they had reasonably good intentions. So they're like, well, space is so important and we need to exploit it, and it's really hard to get things started. So it's okay if we don't tell the whole truth in certain situations. But I think that does erode trust. And I think it is really important that we're going out there and kind of shining a light on these things. And it's interesting because space is a transparent medium, but things are so far away, it's still almost impossible to understand what's happening from a distance. So getting really close like we do and taking images, that's really critical. So those are the three areas that I see that are really important, and how we're trying to help the space environment. And that in turn helps the Earth environment, because there's Earth observation, there's communications from space, and there's a whole bunch of these future applications as well. So I think all of that's really critical, and critical that we maintain that infrastructure.
How reliant, and again, regular Joe average going about his daily business on planet Earth, how reliant are we on satellites? If all the satellites just stop working, what would happen?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a very different answer 30 years ago to what there is today. So 30 years ago, I think you could have gotten around your day to day and you would have said, okay, well, I don't have, I guess, my satellite phone anymore, but otherwise my life is pretty much the same. Today, it's totally different. So you've probably already used it, I think 10 times or so already. And the way that you've done that is by getting, I guess you've probably looked at your clock on your phone.
Yeah.
That timing information is set up by GPS satellites, as well as maybe any GPS that you've used to navigate. Maybe you've, I guess, used apps to try and understand about different meal planning or different, I guess, delivery services as well. And there's a whole bunch of this functionality that's built off the back of satellites. I guess weather's another important one. So if you've looked at the weather forecast today, I think it's very rainy where you are.
Yeah.
all being enabled by satellites as well. So this infrastructure is incredibly important. I think what's really interesting to me about the space space infrastructure is that the majority of the value isn't even created in space, but it's an integral part of the backbone. And then it's so seamless to most of us that we don't even understand that as a part of our lives. So incredibly integrated, but I think there's this really interesting value chain that's happening, and it's really hard to see it in our day-to-day life, even though it's there and it's kind of ubiquitous.
So we've actually got what's actually, if I understood correctly, what's actually happening is we're incredibly reliant on the information that we're getting from some satellites. So it's potentially like just not I don't want to say like a infrastructure or like a junkyard sort of building up there, but potentially the more of these satellites that are going up, there's potential for just like too much up there. So there's the stuff you're providing is probably going to help sort of monitor that and repair that and make sure that stays in equilibrium.
Oh, definitely. And yeah, just I guess for some context, the number of satellites has, I think it's almost 5x over the last 5 years. So just pre-COVID times to now, we've seen a 5x in the number of satellites, which is stupendous. But yeah, I think that said, I think there are a lot of important applications that's opening up. So for example, and every bit of infrastructure that we put in place is actually removal of some infrastructure on Earth. So phone towers is a great example. If we can get direct to cell or direct to mobile coverage from satellites, then we can reduce, I guess, some environmental effects elsewhere. So I think it's net positive having more satellites in space. As you've alluded to, though, I think even though that's true, we still need to manage that resource. And we do need to manage number of satellites. So yeah, I think in this case, weirdly, both are true, and we've just got to be conscious of what the balance is there.
And is there maybe this is prominent, this is a thing, maybe it isn't. Is there ever like a like not a morality clash, but people using the technology for, there's tons of good reasons, but it could be people using it for military purposes or something like that that isn't, no, I don't mean underhand, but do you know what I mean? It might maybe not even just align with your values.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely we have military customers. So I think for most space businesses, it's a big part of how you go about things. Typically, I mean, military customers are typically using it as communications. And Earth observation can be used for what we call targeting. So that's how do you effectively use weapons. I think what's interesting is that it typically makes things more efficient and probably improves survivability. So I think space is probably net positive. So it reduces things like, bombardment by artillery happening. Instead, you send a single missile, and most of the time it saves lives. I think you always see the negative stuff on television. So I think it's typically a net enabler, but then you do get probably the bad uses of space is when you're doing anti-space activities. So I think space being used for Earth is typically a good thing. I think counter space activity is probably where things get a little bit nasty. So that's where you're trying to disrupt GPS, for example. So that's been a big aspect of the Ukrainian-Russian war currently, that GPS is getting jammed more and more, especially in countries that border Russia. So Finland, for example, has large areas where you can't use your DoorDash or Uber because you're getting jammed by the Russians, as an example. So yeah, I think it's these counter space activities that are probably the most negative, and I think we can definitely look at Russia and China to a lesser extent for creating a lot of confusion and trying to make it more of a conflict zone. I think sometimes the West does that as well, but typically we're kind of conforming to a little more rules. But it's an interesting environment out there, that's for sure.
So that sounds a little bit almost like we've got cyber crime, cybersecurity crime, but now we've got I don't want to call it space crime because that's not the right word,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's I'd never. It's so obvious when you talk about it, but I'd never even
Oh
thought
yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
So that's almost like that could be a whole new technology area where we could have people providing
Oh yeah.
and solutions to that. That's crazy.
And frankly, I think Western governments are. You're in the UK. I think the UK government and others around the world, they've realized that actually part of the issue is that most of what the information they're gathering about space is highly classified.
Mm,
And so when these almost crimes, as you say, are happening, it's really hard to attribute them. And so it's really hard to talk about them. So one of the reasons governments like working with us is that we have no such restrictions for sharing data. And so when things happen, and I can give you a specific use case that happened last week, we can start to share that information and start to either deflate a situation because people are talking about things incorrectly and trying to be antagonistic, or we can say actually there's something real happening here and we should all be concerned about that. So I think it can go in both ways, but the key message here is to, I guess, help provide more truth about what's happening rather than us being left to kind of guess and then come up with the wrong assessment, which can lead to either more conflict or more argumentation or what have you.
and I think that's really good and really important, isn't it? Because that word you said there about truth, the average
Yeah.
person doesn't really understand. They understand the concept of space, and they've probably seen Star Wars or Star Trek, and that's probably like the limit of their like knowledge.
Yeah.
And what they actually need is a bit more. And it does feel quite scary, doesn't it? The pace that technology moves at, AI, and
Oh, yeah.
what's the world going to look like? And then you've got people talking about space tech, and people are obviously maybe quite
Yeah.
anxious about what does this actually mean. So it's good to try and anchor the
Yeah.
truths as to here's the benefits.
Yeah. 100%. Hey, so that use case I was speaking about, I can speak to that really
Yeah,
quickly.
yeah.
So,
What happened?
so I think this does affect human spaceflight actually. So there was what we call a debris generation event. Some people will call it an explosion, but we'll talk about, I guess, why that might not be a good way to describe what happens. But some of these debris generation events occur around. There's two space stations in space at the moment. So there's the International Space Station, and where British astronauts and American astronauts and Russian astronauts, that's where they go. Then there's a Chinese space station, that's where taikonauts from China typically go to, and both of those are at what we call relatively low altitude. So one's at 420 kilometers, and the other's at 390, I think. But they're reasonably high above the Earth, but reasonably low compared to the majority of satellites. Now, what happened just over a week ago is that a Russian satellite, it's called Resource P1, it was descending through the atmosphere. I think it was at 370 kilometers or so, and there was a debris generation event. So hundreds of pieces of debris were created. There was a lack of clarity as to why that was. And our customers asked us to investigate it immediately. So we were looking into that pretty soon afterwards. Some claims came out from a few people that there was an explosion, but I think that was based purely on there being debris created rather than any other evidence. So what we did was we had a look at the images that we'd actually already taken images of this satellite, and we'd taken images of other satellites in this series. So Resource P1 was a satellite involved. We also had images of Resource P2 and Resource P3. What we found across all of those satellites is that all of their solar panels seem to have malfunctioned. So instead of being like these solar panels would, if they were functioning correctly, they would kind of extend out and then they would unfold. And what we'd found is that the majority had not even extended out. They were kind of off from the satellite at a kind of arbitrary angle. So what that indicated to us was that there was a common error across all of these satellites where the latching system hadn't worked. So they tried to extend, but it couldn't latch in place. What that meant, it was kind of like a bit of corrugated iron, or I don't know what the UK equivalent is, but a piece of roof, say, that was kind of knocking about in the wind. And as it started to descend through the atmosphere, there's not much atmosphere up there, but there is a little bit. And as that started to become more dense, it was knocking about more, and we think it just detached in the end and brought off some little pieces with it, and that created the debris cloud. And so what most people think was a low energy explosive event, we think was just the satellite coming apart because it had kind of given up on itself, if that makes sense. Now, the reason that it's important to know if it was that or if it exploded was, if it exploded, then we would expect there not to be any more debris generated, and we would expect there to be, I guess, unlikely that debris generation events would happen from other satellites in the series. If what we're saying is true, though, and we're looking to get the money shot and confirm this, if it was just a solar panel that detached along with some other bits of debris, then we should expect that could happen again with the same satellite with a second solar panel. And we should expect that the other satellites in the series, as they descend through the atmosphere, could have more debris generation events. And they're close enough to the manned spaceflight, so the space stations with humans aboard, that they could pose a threat. And people from the International Space Station did go into an evasive mode when this debris generation event happened. So it does matter. It does impact people on orbit, and it does have a monetary impact on life here on Earth as well. So I think that's really critical and why it's important to us for this transparency. So as soon as we saw what our information was indicating, we decided to refund all our customers and say, actually, we're going to instead make this public. And now it's out there and it's part of the discourse. Obviously, I think there's more information we need to gather about whether our hypothesis is true. But I think, yeah, there's been a lot of competing theories, and I think we've got to start putting them to bed and start figuring out exactly what happened.
So is it that story? So there's so many levels why that's really, really cool and really interesting. From a business point of view, you said there about refunding customers and making the information public. So is that just help me understand, like, as you know, in terms of your business model, is that just because you want to enhance your reputation and that will lead to maybe more business? Is that just because of your ethics? What's the sort of reason for that?
Yeah, no, it's a bit of both. So I think it was definitely an ethics reason, and I got to tell you, it was painful because as a startup, we rely on cash flow, so it was painful to refund money, but it was the right thing to do. Now, I mean, we think the ethics that we have is part of our brand. So yeah, it is also a branding marketing exercise, and we will duly take credit when we're, you know, part of the discourse is shown to eventuate. But yeah, I think it was initially ethics, but then that's part of our brand, and I think as you start to have or show your branding to be more and more true, then I think that's only a good thing. So yeah, that's the way we see it. But yeah, very painful decision that we made there.
Well, it's brought me around quite nicely to talking to you about a bit about, you know, the brand bit and the values bit is dead important, and as important is you as a leader. You're the, you know, the figurehead of the business. So talk to me a bit around how you've sort of, you know, how you've led, how I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, how maybe challenging it's been to lead, stick by your values, still grow a viable business, still keep the cash flow coming in. I know it's not easy, like you say, in a startup. How have you managed that during this time? And you know, what is it that you've maybe instilled in your people as you've taken the business forward?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's been I don't know if it's been challenging, but yeah, it's been an interesting journey. So I think first off, there's some values that we can impart. Then there's some values that are imposed upon us, but we're happy to follow because we're, you know, a Western company in a Western nation. And then what we do is considered dual use, and everything in space is. So what that means is that it makes it difficult to export that technology to some countries and use it there. But at the same time, that's fine. That's kind of the society that we live in, and we should really follow. I think it's been easy in a broad sense. I think where it gets difficult is where we're thinking about specific politics of specific nations. So I think this is where it gets interesting around. So for example, I think there's two sides talking about Israel and Palestine as an example. So I think that's a real powder keg topic. And I think there are really good arguments either way. But then when we think about, I guess, who we would sell to at HEO, we have to think about what's good for the, I guess, more in the more general sense. So is it a better thing that these countries don't have access to this technology and so therefore there's more debris generation events? No. So wherever possible, I think it makes more sense to make that technology available. And primarily because our technology is either defensive or informative, and we believe that transparency reduces conflict rather than increases it. I think that makes it very easy for us. And to that end, I think we made a very clear distinction early on that we would never make a weapon. We make information gathering products only. So yeah, really interesting journey that we've been on. But I think it's really about making that clear and making sure that process of thought is clear to people that want to join us. And making it clear to new hires as well. So if they think differently, that's okay. But yeah, we want to be sure about what we're delivering, what we stand for, and about where we draw the line. But yeah, that's how we think about it.
So how, and I get asked this question loads. So obviously part of my role, I'm working with go-to-market professionals for tech firms all day, every day. And I'll speak to people who've worked in maybe a corporate organization or been in the corporate world their whole life, and they've maybe done that for 20 years, and they come along and go, James, I really want to go work for a startup. I want to go work for a scale up. And it's kind of like, the world that you're coming from, the world you're going to is really different. So what's your sort of maybe, I don't know, advice, or where are the obstacles that maybe people don't realize, coming into a business like yours? What is it you're saying to people when they're joining? What are the warnings? There's a lot of cool stuff, but what are the sort of warnings that you're giving to people?
Oh, definitely. Well, actually, it changes throughout the life of the business. So I think at the beginning, it was just the two co-founders primarily, and sometimes we had other people come into the business. But I think it was very clear then that there wasn't a clear path to revenue, and so whoever was part of the business either had to have a second job or they had to think about their lifestyle differently for that period of time. So I think that was the kind of the pre-startup phase. Then there's the startup phase where pay is still low, but there is investment and there's some revenues. And so that's an interesting time where people need to be really committed to the idea. But they get to see just ridiculous amounts of growth if it comes off. And if it doesn't come off, then they've just got to be okay with that being an eventuality as well. And then I'd say we're entering the scale up phase right now. So that's when things have started to work. There's a clear path to, I guess, winning. And now we're just trying to understand about, I guess, how big is the opportunity. So that's a really interesting time. Typically we're very close, or we're at I guess rates they would expect at other companies as well. Plus they still get the upside of equity that they're able to get from a startup scale up. So I think that's a really interesting time as well. And now they're just having to understand that when you're scaling up, there's all these different, I guess, changes in how the company grows, and they'll have to either adapt to the changes or understand that they'll be great at a specific point of the scale up, but might not be good at other points of the scale up as well. So just understanding their place in that journey as well. So yeah, it really does change depending on the time. And yeah, it's interesting at any time, but people might not be, I guess, might not make sense for a specific person to join at a specific time, depending on their either personality or their needs as a human.
It's really interesting. So one of the most common reasons I find people would leave a scale-up business is they go through the journey, and maybe it's different investment rounds or it's different stages of growth, and what they'll say is that the culture's changed, the business has changed, and I actually find I interviewed a girl yesterday who'd gone through a journey of like she joined this business probably before almost like seed funding round. There was not really much there, and had exited, and they were probably like something like I think series. They got to like a Series C funding round, which happened really really quickly. But I actually thought that was really admirable that she'd been able to adapt very quickly at all those different stages, because I often see that not being the case. People, it can change so fluidly and so quickly. So it's really interesting that you're seeing the same, in that you've got you're almost saying it to the team already, which is like, guys, this might feel a bit different in a year or in 2 years, or however things change. So that's interesting.
Definitely. What I will say is that if they're very committed at the beginning, they're still very committed towards the end, but yeah, as you're saying, just the adaptability is key. But it's not necessary either. It's like people are different. So yeah, things change.
So how do you, we can spend, and this is quite a common thing, you spend ages as a leader talking to other leaders, you talking about how are you motivating the team, how are we looking after them, how are we giving a great culture, you talking about the equity and really tying people into your business, how are we exciting them with our vision. So not many people will say to a leader, how are you, how are you, who's actually, who are you, who's mentoring you, who's looking after you, who gives you your pep talk and keeps you going. So how does it work for you, Will? How do you, who are you leaning on to get your ideas and get your inspiration every day?
No, definitely. I mean, there's two things. So one is, yeah, you're right, leading into mentors, and the other is, I guess, going back to your own values and ensuring that you continue to move through that. And it's interesting, like, I think founders are really critical to businesses. So often when we're faced with a decision to make a dramatic change to the business, it's interesting. You do need to be a bit selfish sometimes and say, all right, is that a business that I want to be a part of? So we were talking earlier about working from home versus working from the office, and we have largely a working from the office culture, and that's largely because Haranya, my co-founder, and myself were thinking, would we want to work at a business where most people are not at the office? And the answer is no. That's not how we build things. It's not how we went about things. And what we found very quickly as well is that people that weren't at the office as much just weren't successful. And it turns out there's actually a reason for that as well. It's not just that that's what Haranya and I would like to experience as a culture, but because the business was built in that way, it's actually really hard for the business to change halfway through. And from what we've heard, it could be near impossible. So that's been really interesting as well. And it comes back to not all culture is top down, it's bottom up. And some of that culture was just created when it was only the founders. So it seems like it's top down sometimes, but it's almost like it's been a natural progression, and it just looks like it's top down because it's just progressed in that way. So I think that's really interesting. But going back to mentors, it's really important to have mentors around you and consistently be a learner rather than a teller. So we try and keep that ethos. And yeah, we've got some really great people. Some of my mentors are actually in Tokyo right now, which is great.
Right, cool.
So it's been really awesome to hang out with them and just kind of touch base with them and continue to seek feedback as we move forward.
Do you ever get like imposter syndrome? Lots of founders and leaders talk to me about that, where it's, on the face of it, you look really confident and you know what you're doing, but maybe in the evening or you're lying in bed and you're like, what am I doing? Like, where am I going?
Probably not in the way you mean. So I don't know why this is true, but yeah, like I'm very comfortable on stage and stuff now. So yeah, not really, mainly because I just treat people like equals. So I don't know if that's normal or whatever. That said, I don't always think I'm a great human. So maybe that's more the imposter syndrome. I'm like,
okay,
I wish I was better in this way. So that's maybe more the imposter syndrome. And in reality, I'm just, another human and just trying to get by and make a great life, as well as make a great company with great people working in it. But yeah, that's probably more the way that it comes out.
So it's really interesting the bit you said before about the, refunding your customers and that being an ethical decision rather than a business decision. And then talking about culture and talking about how do we cascade that. I know you talked about, bottom up, but maybe cascading down values and things. It's even like that in itself, just how you are. You're naturally a very down to earth, really approachable guy, and you talk about doing the right thing, and you've got a business that's trying to do the right thing. So it almost like I don't mean that's your culture, but that is a real cornerstone of what this is what we're about. If you come and work here, this is what we're about, and we like coming in the office, and we like being around each other, and we like sharing ideas, and that's how we get stuff done. And almost, that's really important, isn't it, to have that identity? It's not written down, it's not communicated when people join. Here you go, it's in writing. It's just like, this is what we are, and if you're going to succeed here, you want to be on. If you're not on board with that, you're probably not going to enjoy it as much.
Yeah, definitely. We do try to write it though, because that does seem to be important.
Okay.
And yeah, we won't always be around to tell people in a specific situation, but yeah, writing down is important. But it's almost like, instead of writing down what you think it should be, it's almost like experiencing the culture and then writing down what you've experienced. That's probably a good way to. There's more from Harani, my co-founder, who wrote that, but I think it's a really good way to think about things, because yeah, what you think is probably different to what you do, and what you do is the actual culture. So that was interesting. But yeah, I think you're spot on.
So just taking you back to the homework bit, and the office bit, because I just think this is a fascinating area, and it has been now for sort of 5 years since sort of the pandemic, and we all went through that big change, and some people loved it and shut down offices and all sorts. Where you clearly sit in that area, which is like people being together physically is more creative and creates better outcomes for customers and generates better work. Have you seen that maybe as a challenge as you've maybe looked to scale or hired people? Have you lost out on talent maybe along that journey by sticking to that principle? What have been the wins and what have been the maybe downsides to that?
Yeah, I mean, we've lost talent, but I think it was more us understanding who we wanted to work with, and also the talent understanding who they wanted to work with. So I think it was hopefully mainly mutual. But yeah, I think again, it just comes down to, I guess, when it was just two co-founders, how did we work together, and then what is created at that time necessarily impacts what happens at later times. And so I think it's just been an interesting progression. And so even during the pandemic, Haranya and I were often the only people in the office. And it's just the way we wanted to roll during that time. And so it's just continued from there. So I think it's interesting. And it just comes down to little things that you do. So the way you write notes, for example, are written for generally someone's around to explain things. And yeah, that has had some interesting results when we're expanding. So we were originally founded in Sydney. We now have offices in London and Washington, DC. We also have a lot of business in Japan. So we have employees in all those 4 countries. So it's been challenging to kind of promote that culture elsewhere. But I think it's occurred over time, and it occurs because the people internationally see that the most things are done when other people work in a certain way. So that's just adapted to that. So I guess there's some adaptation, and then there's some, I guess, sharing and learning and teaching as well. So both of those seem to have been effective in promoting the culture within the company and helping there.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's such a small word, culture, but it goes so far and it means so many different things. But actually, your starting point of going, the 2 founders of the business worked in this way, and it meant that organically we grew and we got better and things improved, and it's healthy for the business. And you're almost, let's anchor that as that's almost like an culture anchor, isn't it? Like that's the thing that works for us. So we might adapt that over time, but that's fundamentally what really works. And again, I think these things are dead important when we talk about building out company identity and culture for a workforce. That's really cool. Okay, so just a couple of last questions. And I know I get asked this loads. It goes back a little bit to what I was saying before about people who are maybe haven't worked in a scale up, or sometimes people are maybe even looking at becoming founders of their own tech businesses. They've worked in the industry a long time, but maybe they've just not got the confidence to do it. What advice, or what maybe one snippet or bit of advice would you give to somebody who's looking at transitioning into that world, or founding their own tech business?
Yeah. I've actually got one piece of advice that I had to learn. So I think something that wasn't clear to me when I started is that a lot of advice for founders is from venture capitalists, because they're they've got time to do it and they've got branding potential from writing about startups. But what that means is that they've written what they've observed, not what the companies have actually done. So one thing that I found really quickly, they wrote, yes, we like to fund businesses where the founders have gone full time. But what I didn't realize is that that's a sign that the founders have, potentially got some revenue, or there's a clear path for the founders, or they know that they'll get investment so they can commit that time. Also, that it's written primarily by Silicon Valley venture capitalists, where funding is kind of more mainstream and easier to come by. So as an Australian entrepreneur, I didn't realize that. And I was just like, great. So I should throw myself into this full time and not worry about financial consequences. Those are real, and you should look after yourself financially, and you should get the part-time job and work on this project part-time until it becomes a real business. But yeah, that was a huge learning for me, and I encourage any entrepreneur to think about that and be conservative about your financial situation, but then be non-conservative about what you think you can achieve. So it's kind of like managing risk in some ways, and not needing to manage risk in other ways, because like some of the risks that you're managing, like your ambition, that's kind of that feels risky, but actually you're managing a different risk, which is a lack of that ambition will lead to a lack of great outcome. So therefore you should be ambitious and do the risky looking thing. Whereas with finances, it's like, okay, well, you've got to survive.
Yeah.
Really important that you've got something to not necessarily fall back on, but you have to have a base where you can look to do the next thing if things don't work out as well. So I think things like that are really critical, and it's good to be mindful of how people came to these conclusions where they're writing about things. So that was a huge learning, and something I'd recommend to all founders.
Yeah, it's really, it's great advice, isn't it? And it sounds really simple, but it probably really isn't. People might get quite excited and just and I think, almost like you say, there's almost that element of being seen to be doing the right thing, but being seen to look like you know all the answers. So, I'll just leave my high-paid job over here and I'll just become a founder and everything will be fine. But I've got this great idea, but maybe not a great plan on how to get there. And what you're saying is just like, aim big, but take it carefully along the way. Tread carefully. Maybe.
Yeah. So the Jeff Bezos example in that case would be, he didn't leave his job for a bunch of time, and he had the business plan in place already, and etc. There was a time when he had to leave his job, and that was okay. But he'd already de-risked a lot of it. So I think that's interesting as well.
There's a great word, de-risk. There's the word, right? That's the perfect word. Okay, so last question. What's the next mission for HEO? Where are you guys headed? What's the next few years looking like? What you were really excited about?
Yeah, definitely. So currently we're active in what we call the lower part of low Earth orbit, but our customers are really asking and clamoring for us to cover more of Earth orbit. So we're looking to cover high LEO as well, high low Earth orbit. and now to what we call geostationary orbit as well. So that's where a lot of valuable satellites are sitting, and something that our customers are really keen for us to help solve. So yeah, we're really looking for that in the next several years. And then I think we're starting to get some requests for looking at asteroids and moon as well. So obviously that's where we came from. That's something we're passionate about. So we're keen to start looking into those missions as well, some of which we'll be able to start announcing in the kind of medium term.
Right. Okay. And if people are listening to us and they're like, these guys sound cool. Will sounds like a cool guy. I'm interested in working in this sector. You said you've got a presence sort of globally now. Are there any areas where you guys are, really perhaps interested to hear from people, or any skill set that there's a gap in the business? What sort of things might interest you guys at the minute?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think people that are really technical in the geospatial industry and all things like mechatronics or astrodynamics or all of those space-related fields, I think all of those are really interesting. And it's more about you being passionate to try or apply your skills into a new kind of space. And I think there's other interesting roles as well, like go-to-market and marketing even, and what we call space mission analysts. So those are people that are essentially acting like a geospatial analyst, but for the non-Earth imaging kind of realm. So I think all of those are interesting. We often hire or put job descriptions on our website. So please go to www.heospace.com to kind of have a look, and please follow along on social media. So yeah.
Cool. Okay. Awesome message. I lied. I've got one last question.
Oh,
it's a bit of a fun question. It's more of a fun question.
Go on.
And it's to do with, like, you guys are obviously, doing this stuff up in space. Is it realistic that people can live up there? And if so, like, how long might that be?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's definitely realistic. Really, I wouldn't want to do it, and right now, and the reason is that there are a lot of unknowns right now, and we really don't know what long-term living in space does to the human body. So I think you would, if you want to do it, I think you should explore those options and put your hand up if the opportunity comes. But I think you should also be cognizant that it is still a risky situation. It's kind of like initial air flight, right? Like, it was very risky to begin with, and it's like that in space now today. So yeah, beware of the risk, but also
you don't fancy it. You don't fancy it. You're not going to be going up there anytime soon.
No, I think it's very exciting though, and I do appreciate the people that do it, and I count some, or I think some astronauts are my friends. But yeah, like, they've done amazing things, but yeah, I think it's definitely not for everyone. But it will become more ubiquitous someday. So kind of like air travel has become. Yeah. I think space travel will as well.
Yeah, I don't think it's that far away either. So yeah, interesting times. Definitely. Well, Will, this has been absolutely fascinating. So thank you for taking the time. It's been so interesting. It's one of those topics that you can find yourself just going down loads of different avenues. It's just so vast and so interesting, and what you guys are doing just seems so cool. So thank you for taking the time.
No, I really appreciate your time today, James. Thanks for the chat.